The unraveling of justice. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned as they swung open, announcing the arrival of Judge Eleanor Whitmore. The courtroom, already silent, seemed to tighten in anticipation of her entrance. She strode purposefully to her seat, her black robe billowing slightly, her sharp gray eyes surveying the room with practiced indifference. Her reputation preceded her, ruthless, unwavering, a staunch enforcer of the law. She had sat on the bench for over 20 years, earning a name for herself as a judge who showed no leniency, no patience for excuses, no tolerance for emotion. Justice, in her eyes, was cold, calculated, and absolute. As she settled into her chair, she barely spared a glance at the two boys standing before her. Their wrists were bound in handcuffs, their faces set with tension. Joshua and Jordan Hayes, 15-year-old twins, stood accused of attempted robbery. Case number 4829. The clerk read, Joshua and Jordan Hayes, charged with attempted theft, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. The twins stood side by side, identical in every way except the look in their eyes. Joshua's was filled with quiet determination, Jordan's with restrained fury. Both wore button-down shirts and slacks, their clothes pressed but slightly worn. They had dressed to make a good impression, but Eleanor hardly noticed. She sighed, flipping through the case file. Let's proceed. Prosecution, state your case. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Philip Grayson, stepped forward. His confidence was evident as he adjusted his tie, looking at the twins as if they were already convicted. Your Honor, on the night of September 10th, the defendants entered the high-end jewelry store Camden Lux. The store manager, Evan Calloway, observed them acting suspiciously, whispering, loitering, handling expensive merchandise without any intent to purchase. When approached by security, they attempted to flee. Upon search, they were found with a large sum of cash, evidence suggesting premeditation for theft. Eleanor barely lifted her eyes. Is there surveillance footage confirming the attempted theft? Grayson hesitated for a fraction of a second. There is no footage of them actually taking anything, but their behavior was clearly suspicious. The store manager, Mr. Calloway, insists he saw them behaving like typical shoplifters. Typical shoplifters. Joshua finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. Your Honor, we weren't stealing anything. We had the money to buy what we came for. We were there to buy a gift for our foster mom. Silence. Eleanor snapped, raising a hand. You will speak when addressed. Jordan clenched his fists but said nothing. His brother took a deep breath, swallowing the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Their public defender, Mr. Randall, an overworked and underpaid lawyer, finally stood up. Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on nothing more than assumption and racial profiling. The boys had the exact amount of money needed for the purchase. They have no criminal records, no history of theft, and their foster mother is prepared to testify that they worked all summer to save for this gift. Eleanor exhaled sharply. And yet, they resisted arrest. Because they were being falsely accused. Randall shot back. The store manager never even let them explain. He assumed they were thieves the moment they walked in. The courtroom murmured, tension rippling through the crowd. The gallery was packed. Reporters, activists, concerned citizens, and the boy's foster mother, Lorraine Hayes, who sat wringing her hands. Eleanor glanced at the twins, then at the documents before her. To her, this was an open and shut case. The law had been broken. Whether or not these boys had stolen anything, they had caused a disturbance. That was enough. Enough theatrics, she declared. The facts stand. The defendants exhibited behavior consistent with an intent to commit theft. They resisted lawful orders from security personnel. I see no reason to dismiss these charges. Jordan's patience finally snapped. You're not even listening. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Eleanor's eyes flashed with irritation. Excuse me? You don't care about the truth, Jordan continued, his voice shaking. You just see two black kids in court and assume we're guilty." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters' hands flew to their phones, capturing the moment. Joshua tried to tug his brother's arm, but Jordan refused to back down. "Enough," Eleanor bellowed, reaching for her gavel. The wooden hammer came down with force, but in her anger, it slipped from her grasp. Everything happened in a blink. The gavel, heavy and polished, spun through the air, striking Jordan in the temple. He crumpled instantly, a sharp cry of pain escaping his lips as he hit the courtroom floor. For a heartbeat, the entire room was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Joshua dropped to his knees beside his twin, panic overtaking his features. Lorraine rushed forward, pushing past the bailiff. "Someone call an ambulance," a voice shouted. Phones were already recording. Reporters whispered frantically into their microphones. The moment was being broadcast live. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand still suspended where the gavel had been. Her heart pounded, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She had lost control. The sight of blood on the polished wood of the courtroom floor sent a wave of nausea through her. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was her courtroom. She controlled the narrative. But now, the world was watching. The emergency medical team arrived within minutes, wheeling Jordan out on a stretcher. Joshua went with him, his face pale with fear. Lorraine turned toward Eleanor, her expression a mixture of fury and devastation. "You did this," she whispered. "You did this." Eleanor's stomach churned, but her years of discipline forced her to maintain her expression. "It was an accident," she said, but even to her own ears, the words felt hollow. The trial was suspended. The courtroom emptied. Reporters swarmed outside, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping as they shouted for statements. Eleanor made her way to her chambers, locking the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she sank into her chair. She turned to the single-framed photograph on her desk, a picture of her daughter, Clara, smiling at her law school graduation. She had been so proud of Clara, who had followed in her footsteps. Her phone buzzed. A text from Clara. "Mom, I saw the video. Call me." Eleanor swallowed hard. The gavel incident was all over the news. The footage of her striking a teenage boy, the protests already forming outside, the legal scrutiny that would inevitably follow. And for the first time in her career, Eleanor Whitmore felt something foreign. Fear. A knock at her door made her flinch. "Judge Whitmore," came the hesitant voice of her assistant, Margaret. "The Chief Justice wants to see you. Now." Eleanor closed her eyes. She had spent her entire career believing she was untouchable. But now, justice was coming for her, and it would not be kind. The fall of Judge Whitmore. Eleanor Whitmore had presided over thousands of cases in her career, but now, for the first time, she was the one under judgment. The Chief Justice's office was cold, sterile, fitting, considering the reason she was here. The moment she entered, the heavy door closed behind her with a resounding thud, making her stomach clench. Across the expansive mahogany desk sat Chief Justice Harold Lancaster, his fingers steepled in front of him. His normally patient expression was unreadable. To Eleanor's right, District Attorney Patricia Monroe sat stiffly, her arms crossed. The way she studied Eleanor, like a prosecutor preparing to rip into a defendant, sent another wave of unease through her. "Sit," Lancaster said, his tone devoid of warmth. Eleanor obeyed, smoothing the front of her robe out of habit. A thin layer of sweat had formed at the base of her neck, but she willed herself to keep her posture straight. "I assume you know why you're here," Monroe said, her voice edged with ice. Eleanor pressed her lips together. "It was an accident." Monroe scoffed. "That accident is already viral. Millions have seen the footage of you striking a black teenager with your gavel. The protests have already begun. They're calling it judicial brutality," Lancaster added, rubbing his temples. "Civil rights organizations are demanding your immediate resignation." Eleanor felt a flicker of indignation rise in her chest. Are we really going to let public outrage dictate legal proceedings now? The boy was out of line. He disrespected the court. Monroe's eyes flashed with something close to disgust. You lost control, Judge Whitmore. That's the story now. And this isn't the first time your courtroom decisions have been controversial. Eleanor stiffened. What are you insinuating? Monroe slid a thick file across the desk. We pulled your sentencing records. Do you know what we found? Eleanor glanced down at the documents, but Monroe wasn't waiting for an answer. In the last 10 years, your rulings have disproportionately affected Black and Latino defendants, Monroe continued. Harsher sentences, higher bail amounts, a pattern of dismissing evidence in favor of the prosecution. And now, the media is digging through all of it. Eleanor's mouth went dry. I have always followed the law. No, you followed your law, Lancaster said grimly. And now, it's coming back to haunt you. Monroe leaned forward. Tell me, Judge Whitmore, how does it feel to be on the other side of the gavel? The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, Lancaster exhaled, rubbing his temple. Here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, you are placed on indefinite administrative leave while we conduct an internal review. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Indefinite, she repeated, barely able to keep the disbelief from her voice. You should prepare yourself. Eleanor, Lancaster continued, his voice softer now. This may not end in your favor. Monroe smirked. Consider this your first real lesson in accountability. The weight of the moment pressed down on Eleanor as she rose from her seat. As she walked toward the door, she could feel their eyes on her, watching, judging. She had spent decades handing down punishments. Now, for the first time, she was the one being sentenced. The world waits as the GDG fails. Eleanor barely made it home before the first wave of reporters descended on her property. Judge Whitmore, do you have a statement about the incident in your courtroom? Are you resigning? Will you be facing charges? The questions flew at her like bullets, and Eleanor pushed through the crowd, her hands trembling. She slammed the door behind her, pressing her back against it as the noise of the reporters was muffled by the thick walls of her home. The house was eerily quiet. She had always liked it that way, orderly, controlled. But now, the silence felt oppressive. She turned on the TV, only to be met with her own image plastered across the screen. A shocking incident in Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom has sparked national outrage after she was caught on video striking a black teenager with her gavel. Civil rights organizations are calling for her removal from the bench, citing a history of racial bias in her rulings. As the investigation unfolds, the question remains, was this an isolated incident or part of a much larger problem within the justice system? Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was a message from her daughter, Clara. Mom, you need to call me. Now. For the first time that night, Eleanor hesitated before picking up. Clara answered on the first ring. Mom, she said, her voice tight. What the hell did you do? Eleanor closed her eyes. It was an accident. An accident? Mom, you hit a kid in open court. Do you know what's happening out here? The protests are growing. People are calling for your disbarment. Eleanor rubbed her temple. You don't understand. That boy disrespected my courtroom. I was only maintaining order. Order. Clara's voice cracked. You sounded just like Grandpa just now. Eleanor flinched. Her father had been a judge before her, a harsh, unyielding man who saw justice as an iron fist, not a balancing scale. She had spent her entire life trying to prove that she was better than him. But now, had she become the very thing she despised? Clara exhaled sharply. Listen to me, Mom. This isn't just going to blow over. You have to start listening for once in your life. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. I don't need a lecture. Then what do you need, Mom? Clara's voice softened. Because right now, you sound like someone who just realized she might not be the hero of her own story. Eleanor had no response to that. For the first time in her career, She didn't have a single word to say. She ended the call, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. The walls of her perfect world were closing in, and she was beginning to realize maybe she deserved it. The fire. The night was thick with smoke when Eleanor woke to the sound of sirens. The acrid scent hit her lungs, and for a split second, she thought it was a nightmare. Then she heard the screams. Rushing to the window, her heart seized at the sight before her. Her house, her beautiful, pristine home, was on fire. Flames licked at the roof, smoke billowing into the night sky. Firefighters swarmed the scene, but the blaze was spreading too fast. And then she heard the most chilling sound of all. Her daughter's voice. Mom. Clara's screams cut through the chaos. The kids, they're trapped inside. Eleanor's world tilted. Emma and Tyler, her grandchildren, still inside. Before she could move, a truck screeched to a stop at the curb. Two figures jumped out, sprinting toward the burning house. Eleanor's breath caught. Joshua and Jordan Hayes, the very boys she had condemned just days ago. Without hesitation, they vanished into the inferno. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, felt completely powerless. She could only watch as the flames consumed everything, and pray that the boy she had once refused to see as human would make it out alive. Into the fire. The fire burned like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Thick black smoke billowed into the night sky, curling and twisting as if reaching for the heavens. The flames roared, their intensity casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen, her mind unable to process what was happening. Her house, her sanctuary, her fortress, was an inferno. But none of that mattered, because her grandchildren were inside. She could still hear Clara screaming, the raw terror in her voice slicing through the chaos. Emma, Tyler. The children's names carried over the wail of sirens, but there was no response. Eleanor's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then she saw them. Joshua and Jordan Hayes, the twins she had condemned in her courtroom just days ago. They had already vanished into the fire. Eleanor took a step forward, her legs trembling beneath her. No, someone stop them, she cried, but her voice was lost in the noise. The firefighters were still preparing their hoses, shouting orders to one another. They were fast, but not fast enough. She could do nothing but watch as the boys she had wronged threw themselves into the blaze without hesitation. Time slowed. Every second stretched into eternity. The fire crackled and snapped, devouring wood and glass. Eleanor's mind raced with every possible outcome, every worst-case scenario. What if they didn't make it? What if she had sent those boys to their deaths? The thought sent a cold shudder through her. Clara gripped her arm, her nails digging into Eleanor's sleeve. "Mom," she sobbed. "Please, they have to make it." Eleanor had no answer. She had spent her life delivering verdicts, deciding the fates of others with the simple swing of a gavel. But now, standing outside her burning home, she realized how powerless she truly was. And then, through the swirling smoke, movement, a figure emerged. Joshua. He stumbled forward, coughing violently, his clothes singed and covered in soot. In his arms, cradled tightly against his chest, was Emma. A wave of relief crashed over Eleanor, her knees nearly giving out. Then she saw Jordan. He was behind his brother, carrying Tyler, but his steps were uneven. His body swayed as he exited the house, the weight of the child in his arms dragging him down. The moment he reached the cool night air, his legs buckled, and he collapsed. Jordan. Joshua dropped to his knees beside his twin, his breath still ragged. Firefighters rushed forward, paramedics pushing through the chaos. "He's not breathing," someone shouted. Eleanor's heart lurched. No, not like this. She had already taken so much from these boys. She couldn't bear the thought of taking more. The paramedics worked quickly, pressing oxygen masks over the twins' faces, checking vitals, stabilizing them. Eleanor hovered nearby, her breath caught in her throat, afraid to move, afraid to even hope. Finally, after what felt like forever, Jordan gasped sharply, his body jolting as his lungs dragged in a breath of air. A sob of relief escaped Clara. Eleanor felt her own throat tighten. "They're okay," one of the paramedics announced, checking over the twins. "Mild smoke inhalation, but they'll be fine." Eleanor wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she could only stare at the two boys, the same ones she had sentenced to a future of struggle, the same ones she had dismissed so easily. They had saved her grandchildren. They had risked everything. And she had never once given them the benefit of the doubt. The realization hit her harder than any gavel ever could. The piracy of justice. The fire was under control by the time dawn arrived. The house was destroyed, but the structure still stood, barely. Eleanor sat on the curb outside, wrapped in a blanket provided by a paramedic. She wasn't cold. She wasn't anything. Clara sat beside her, cradling Emma and Tyler, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of crying. The exhaustion on her daughter's face was painful to see. The press had arrived. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. A few even tried to get close, but were held back by police. The video of the rescue had already gone viral. The headlines had written themselves. "Judge who condemned black teens watches them save her grandchildren. Heroes or victims. The boys the system failed risk everything for their accuser." The fall of Judge Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor hadn't turned on her phone. She didn't have to. She already knew what the world was saying. She had spent her life believing she understood justice. Now she wasn't sure she even understood herself. She glanced toward the ambulance where Joshua and Jordan sat on the open back step, still wearing oxygen masks. Lorraine Hayes, their foster mother, stood beside them, her expression unreadable. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady. Slowly, she approached. Joshua saw her first. His face was blank, but his eyes held something. Not anger, but not forgiveness either. Jordan, still recovering from the smoke, didn't meet her gaze. Lorraine folded her arms. "If you're here to say thank you, don't bother," she said, her voice sharp. "They didn't do it for you." Eleanor swallowed. "I know," she admitted. Silence stretched between them. Eleanor had never struggled for words before, but now, standing before these boys, she had no idea what to say. Jordan finally spoke, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "You still think we're criminals?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. "No," she whispered. "I never should have thought that in the first place." Lorraine scoffed. "Now you say that. After what you put them through." Eleanor looked down, ashamed. "I was wrong." Jordan huffed out a breath, shaking his head. "Yeah, you were." Joshua studied her, his gaze calculating. "Are you going to do something about it?" Eleanor hesitated. This wasn't about an apology. They didn't want words. They wanted change. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor knew she had to give it to them. She had spent 20 years wielding power, shaping fates with the stroke of a pen. Now she had to use that power to undo the damage she had done. "I don't expect you to believe me," she said quietly, "but I am going to make this right." Joshua arched a skeptical brow. "How?" Eleanor exhaled. "I don't know yet, but she would figure it out." Because for the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore was no longer the judge. She was the one on trial, and redemption would not come easily. The reckoning begins. The fire had destroyed Eleanor Whitmore's house, but the flames hadn't stopped there. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built over decades was now reduced to ashes, and she deserved it. She had spent her life wielding power, believing she was the final word on justice. But now, justice had turned its gaze upon her. And for the first time in her life, she was afraid. The world what he see he is here fedel. Eleanor sat at the edge of the stiff hotel bed, the cheap mattress creaking beneath her. The curtains were drawn, but she could still hear the distant hum of voices outside, the reporters who had been camped out for 2 days straight. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching it. She didn't need to. Every channel was talking about her. The once respected Judge Eleanor Whitmore finds herself at the center of national outrage after striking a black teenager with her gavel, an act caught on camera and now viewed over 50 million times online. The incident has sparked widespread protests, with activists demanding her removal from the bench and a full review of her past rulings. Experts are now dissecting her judicial record, uncovering patterns of racial bias in her sentencing over the past 20 years. Eleanor clenched her jaw and muted the television. Her hands trembled as she reached for the manila folder on the nightstand, the one she had barely been able to bring herself to open. Inside were pages upon pages of legal documents, all highlighting one horrifying truth. She had failed. Not just in one case, not just with Joshua and Jordan Hayes, but in hundreds of cases. She had sentenced black defendants to harsher punishments than their white counterparts. She had denied bail disproportionately to people of color. She had dismissed evidence, ignored mitigating circumstances, and accepted the word of prosecutors without question. And she had done it all without ever realizing, or worse, without ever caring. Her stomach turned as she read through the names of the people she had condemned. Darnell Hayes, Marcus Thompson, Vanessa Green. People who had pleaded for her to listen. People she had ignored. People she had destroyed. A sharp knock at the hotel door made her jump. She hesitated before answering. When she opened it, she was met with the last person she expected to see. Joshua Anderson, the face of her GGG mini end. Joshua stood in the hallway, arms crossed. He looked different from the boy who had stood before her in the courtroom. He no longer carried the same uncertainty. Now he was the one with power. Eleanor stepped aside without a word, allowing him in. As he entered, he glanced around the small, impersonal hotel room, his sharp eyes taking in the half-empty suitcase, the untouched food, the piles of legal documents scattered across the desk. "You look like you haven't slept," he noted. Eleanor exhaled sharply. "I haven't." Joshua nodded as if that answer satisfied him. He walked to the window, peering out at the crowd below. "They're not going away, you know." "I know." He turned to face her. "So what are you going to do about it?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I don't know yet." Joshua studied her for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a single sheet of paper. He held it out to her. She took it with shaky hands. It was a case file. She recognized the name immediately. Darnell Hayes. Eleanor's stomach clenched. "I know you've been going through your old cases," Joshua said, "but I wanted to make sure you saw this one." She already knew what she would find. She had reviewed the case before. But this time, she forced herself to read it with new eyes. Darnell had been accused of armed robbery. A witness had identified him, but the surveillance footage was inconclusive. He had provided an alibi, one that had never been properly investigated. His defense attorney had been overworked and underprepared. And she, Judge Eleanor Whitmore, had sentenced him to 15 years in prison without ever questioning the case against him. 15 years. She had stolen 15 years of a man's life. And now she was finally seeing the truth. Eleanor's throat tightened. She struggled for words. "I need to fix this." Joshua's gaze didn't waver. "Then do it." Eleanor's hands tightened around the file. "I will." For the first time in her life, she was about to fight for someone else's justice instead of blindly enforcing the law. And she had no idea where it would lead her. The first battle. The next morning, Eleanor did something she had never done before. She walked into the Riverside Community Center, a place she had never set foot in before, because before it had never seemed important. But now she understood. This was where the people she had condemned gathered. This was where they fought back against the system she had upheld. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The moment she stepped in, the murmurs started. "That's her. The judge. The one who hurt those boys." The whispers burned through her like fire. But she didn't turn away. At the center of the room, Lorraine Hayes stood beside a table, her arms crossed. When she saw Eleanor, her expression hardened. "You have a lot of nerve coming here," she said. Eleanor met her gaze. "I need your help." Lorraine's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Now you need my help." Eleanor exhaled. "I want to overturn Darnell Hayes's conviction." Silence fell over the room. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Lorraine let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, now do you care? Now that your own life is falling apart, you suddenly want to make things right." Eleanor felt every word like a slap, but she didn't back down. "Yes," she admitted, "I should have cared sooner. But I didn't, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." Lorraine's expression flickered. She had expected defensiveness, excuses. She hadn't expected honesty. Eleanor took a step closer. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I can try to fix it, if you'll let me." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Lorraine spoke. "What do you need?" And just like that, the war for justice began. The final verdict. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her life delivering verdicts. But now, she was standing trial. Not in a courtroom. Not before a judge. But in the eyes of the people she had spent her career condemning. And there was no telling what her final sentence would be. But for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight for redemption. No matter the cost. Trial by fire. Eleanor Whitmore had spent decades believing she was the law. But now, for the first time in her life, she was about to learn what justice truly meant. She sat at the edge of an old metal chair in the Riverside Community Center, surrounded by people she had wronged. The air was thick with tension, and the walls felt like they were closing in. She had come here willingly. But that didn't mean she was welcome. A circle of folding chairs had been arranged in the center of the room, filled with mothers who had lost their sons to the system, young men who had been locked away under her rulings, and activists who had spent years fighting against people like her. At the front of the group stood Lorraine Hayes. Eleanor had expected this meeting to be difficult. She hadn't expected it to feel like an execution. "All right, Judge Whitmore," Lorraine said, arms crossed. "You said you want to make things right. Let's hear it." Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had rehearsed this in her head 100 times, but now that she was actually here, the words felt insufficient. "I was wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not just about the Anderson twins, not just about Darnell Hayes, about everything. I spent my career thinking I was enforcing the law fairly, but I wasn't. I was blind to my own prejudices, and because of that, I destroyed lives." Silence. Then a voice from the back. Now she wants sympathy. Another voice. "Where was this realization when my son was locked up for stealing food?" Anger rippled through the group like wildfire. Eleanor let it happen. She didn't defend herself. She had no defense. "I know that words aren't enough," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to fix what I can. I want to fight to overturn wrongful convictions. I want to take apart the system I upheld." She met Lorraine's gaze. "But I can't do it alone." Lorraine's lips pressed together, her sharp eyes searching Eleanor's face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded. "Fine," Lorraine said. "Then you're going to prove it." Eleanor frowned. "How?" Lorraine turned to the group. "You all have stories. You all have names. Tell her." And one by one, they did. A mother spoke first, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn photo of her son. "My boy was 17. Got caught with a dime bag of weed. Your courtroom gave him 5 years. 5. A white boy in the same county got probation for the same thing." Eleanor's stomach twisted. A young man leaned forward, his face hard. "I spent 3 years in juvie because the judge, you, believed a store owner over me, even when there was no proof." Eleanor flinched. She remembered him. A woman with deep lines in her face spoke next. My husband was sentenced by you. He had an alibi. You didn't even let him speak. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about one case. This wasn't about the Anderson twins. This wasn't about Darnell Hayes. This was about hundreds of people, and Eleanor had to face them all. The CACHHANGDEV thing. Later that night, Eleanor sat in a dimly lit law office across from Charles Davenport, one of the city's fiercest defense attorneys. Across his desk, folders were stacked high, each one representing a case that needed to be overturned. But there was one case in particular that had brought her here. Darnell Hayes, the man she had wrongfully sentenced to 15 years in prison. Charles adjusted his glasses and studied her. "So," he said, flipping through the documents, "you finally grew a conscience." Eleanor exhaled. "I grew a spine." He raised a brow. "All right, then let's see if you're really serious about this." He slid a document toward her. "This is a motion to reopen Darnell's case. New evidence. Witness recantations. We're filing this tomorrow morning." Eleanor nodded, her hand steady as she took the paper. This was it, her first real step toward justice. She glanced up at Charles. "What are the chances we win?" Charles leaned back in his chair. "With your name behind this, better than they were yesterday." Eleanor swallowed. She had spent years ensuring convictions held. Now she was fighting to overturn one of her own. And it was just the beginning. A city divided. By the next morning, the battle lines had been drawn. The city was in uproar. Half of the public saw Eleanor Whitmore as a villain finally facing her downfall. The other half saw her as a hypocrite, a woman trying to redeem herself only because she had no other choice. The courthouse steps were flooded with protesters. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for Darnell Hayes. Free the innocent. Whitmore must pay." Others carried signs with different messages. "Too little, too late. You don't to be the hero now. JGG is, like her beauty, this system." Eleanor walked through the crowd with her head high. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. She listened. And for the first time in her life, she understood. She had spent years pretending that justice was blind. But justice had never been blind. She had been. The fight for Darnell Hayes. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Marcus Martinez sat at the bench, his fingers steepled as he listened to Charles Davenport present their motion. The district attorney, James Wilson, was arguing against them. "This is absurd," Wilson said, shaking his head. The conviction was sound. The defendant was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Was he? Charles shot back, his voice razor-sharp, "Because we have 4 witnesses who now say they were pressured into testifying against him." Eleanor sat in the gallery, her hands curled into fists. She watched as Wilson tried to do exactly what she used to do: shut down the defense, dismiss new evidence, keep the system intact. It made her sick. Judge Martinez turned to Eleanor. "Judge Whitmore, you sentenced Mr. Hayes. Do you believe his conviction was just?" Eleanor stood. The entire courtroom was silent. Every camera was on her. She exhaled and met the judge's gaze. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I was wrong." A gasp rippled through the room. Eleanor continued. "I made assumptions instead of asking questions. I let my biases affect my rulings. I didn't listen. And because of that, I sent an innocent man to prison." She took a deep breath. "And now, I'm asking you to do what I should have done years ago." Judge Martinez studied her, then nodded. "I'll review the motion and issue my decision in the morning." The gavel fell. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Eleanor was fighting on the right side. And she wasn't going to stop. The final verdict. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 20 years in the courtroom, deciding the fates of others with the strike of a gavel. But today, she wasn't behind the bench. She was in the gallery, waiting, judging herself. The moment of truth. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, families of the wrongly convicted. Every seat was taken. The weight of their eyes pressed down on Eleanor as she sat beside Joshua and Jordan Anderson, the twins she had once condemned, and Lorraine Hayes, the foster mother who had never stopped fighting for justice. At the front of the room, Darnell Hayes stood next to his attorney, Charles Davenport. His orange jumpsuit, a symbol of the 15 years stolen from him, stood out starkly against the polished wood of the courtroom. Judge Marcus Martinez sat behind the bench, flipping through pages of Darnell's case file. He had spent the last 3 days reviewing the evidence. Every witness statement, every legal argument, every mistake Eleanor had made. And now, the moment had come. Judge Martinez cleared his throat. This court has reviewed the motion to overturn the conviction of Darnell Hayes, he began, after considering new evidence, including recanted witness testimonies, previously ignored alibi statements, and allegations of misconduct in the prosecution. This court finds that Mr. Hayes did not receive a fair trial. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, this court determines that Mr. Hayes's conviction must be overturned immediately. A wave of cheers erupted from the gallery. Lorraine sobbed, clutching Darnell's arm. Joshua and Jordan let out sharp exhales, their shoulders releasing years of pent-up tension. And Darnell, who had spent 15 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit, stood frozen, staring, disbelief written across his face. I'm free, he whispered. Charles nodded, smiling for the first time in days. You're freed, Darnell. Darnell's breath shuddered. And then, as if his body finally caught up with his mind, he dropped into his sister Monica's arms, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 15 years. 15 years lost. 15 years stolen. And now, it was over. The PRIC of redemption. Eleanor sat still as the chaos unfolded around her. The celebration. The tears. The relief. She had spent months fighting for this moment. And yet, she felt no relief. Because this wasn't a victory. This was justice that should have been served 15 years ago. And she had been the one to deny it. A voice pulled her out of her thoughts. You did good today. She turned to see Joshua Anderson, his eyes searching hers. Eleanor's throat tightened. I should have done it sooner. Yeah, Joshua agreed. You should have. The words stung, but she welcomed the pain. She deserved it. Jordan crossed his arms. What happens now? Eleanor hesitated. To Darnell. Jordan shook his head. To you. The question lingered in the air. She already knew the answer. Her fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A system VUL to on injustice. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself back at the Riverside Community Center, standing in front of a room filled with former inmates, activists, and public defenders. All of them were staring at her, waiting, watching. Judge Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had destroyed lives, the woman who was now trying to repair them. She took a deep breath. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, she began. For 20 years, I sat behind a bench and handed down sentences, believing I was upholding the law. She swallowed hard. But I wasn't serving justice. I was serving a system designed to break people like you. Murmurs rippled through the room. She continued. I believed the system was fair. I was wrong. She exhaled sharply. I believed the law was blind. I was wrong. Silence. She clenched her fists. I destroyed lives, she admitted. And now, I want to spend the rest of my life fighting to fix what I broke. The weight of her words hung heavy. Then, from the back of the room, applause. Slow, measured. It was Lorraine Hayes. She nodded once, and then another clap, and another, until the entire room was on their feet. Eleanor blinked rapidly, her heart pounding. This wasn't forgiveness. She didn't expect that. But it was acknowledgement. And that was enough. Facing here or Ogun trial. 2 weeks later, Eleanor sat in a different courtroom. Only this time, she wasn't the judge. She was the defendant. The Judicial Ethics Committee had launched an investigation into her sentencing history. She had already resigned from the bench. But that wasn't enough. People wanted her disbarred. Some wanted her charged with civil rights violations. Others wanted to erase every ruling she had ever made. And maybe they were right. She had spent 2 decades building a reputation. It had taken 2 seconds to lose it. And now she had to face the consequences. The hearing lasted 4 hours. She was asked about every case she had ever ruled on, every decision she had ever made. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She answered honestly. And at the end of it, the committee issued their ruling. Her law license was suspended indefinitely. Her judicial record would be reviewed and audited. Her legacy was officially destroyed. And for the first time in 20 years, Eleanor Whitmore wasn't a judge. She was just a woman trying to undo the damage she had done. A fine ale, the sun was setting when Eleanor left the courthouse, stepping into the cool evening air. She barely noticed the reporters. She barely noticed the cameras. But she did notice the person waiting for her, Darnell Hayes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Darnell inhaled deeply. "It's weird seeing you out here instead of in a robe." Eleanor let out a breath. "It's weird not being in one." Darnell studied her, then said, "You really lost everything, huh?" She nodded. "Yeah." Silence. Then, to her shock, Darnell extended his hand. Eleanor stared at it. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because," Darnell said, "you finally did what no one else would." Eleanor hesitated, then took his hand. And in that moment, she knew. She would never be redeemed. She didn't deserve to be. But maybe, just maybe, she could do something that mattered.